Can a court legally compel a multi-billion-dollar oil giant to cut its fossil fuel production? That is the question at the heart of a landmark trial unfolding in France. You are listening to Climate Court Voices, a podcast where we speak with the individuals leading crucial climate lawsuits and championing environmental justice efforts worldwide. In this episode, we look at how these lawsuits could fundamentally rewrite the rules of corporate climate accountability. In 2020, a powerful coalition comprising the City of Paris and several environmental non-profits filed a lawsuit against TotalEnergies. They took aim at the strategy of continuous oil and gas expansion pursued despite decades of indisputable scientific warnings. Their demands are clear: stop new fossil fuel projects and adopt specific, enforceable measures to reduce emissions in line with a credible 1.5 degrees pathway, not only from its own operations, but also from the use of its products. Following a 6-year jurisdictional battle, French judges finally heard the core merits of the case in a 2-day hearing this February. One of the key legal minds pushing this battle forward from the very beginning is Paul Mougeolle. Paul joined Notre Affaire, Tous, one of the lead NGOs behind the lawsuit, back in 2017 while writing his doctoral thesis on climate due diligence. What started as volunteer work evolved into Paul becoming the group's legal strategic advisor, coordinating a case born in the wake of a historic victory in the Netherlands, where activists successfully forced British Shell to account for its massive carbon footprint. At the time, the global climate litigation movement was gaining serious momentum, first targeting negligent states, and now shifting the crosshairs directly onto corporate giants.
When I joined Notre Affaire, so in 2017, the NGO was very young and it didn't have like a proper track record at that point, but it was already clear from the climate litigation movement that there would be two main targets, if you will. On one hand, states, and on the other, corporate actors. And that's how we also then devised our own activities. And so in the year 2018, we launched the case against the state. It was a very important case. And we did it with several other partners, NGO partners, Oxfam, Greenpeace, La Fondation Nicolas Hulot. And we also released an online petition, and it's still so far the most supported online petition in France. So 2.5 million people signed it. And on the other hand, we launched the case against TotalEnergies. And what we did is, since we were still very young and not known by the public, and we didn't have like any proper track record, so we had to find allies who have some credibility. So we found one important NGO, Sherpa, who especially contributed to the adoption of the French duty of vigilance law. That's a really important law in France, but also for the movement more generally, because it introduced the idea that multinational actors also have to protect human rights and the environment along their supply chains and their corporate group. And so we relied on this law to make our climate case.
Before we look at the legal mechanics, we need to talk about the sheer scale of the company in the crosshairs. TotalEnergies isn't just a major corporation, it is a global empire. Statistically, it sits among the 20 largest historical greenhouse gas emitters on the planet. But instead of cutting back, Total is actually planning to increase its oil and gas production by about 3% every single year over the next 5 years. In fact, it plans to funnel at least 2/3 of its capital investments strictly into fossil fuels until 2030. Right now, Total is linked to the highest number of new, major fossil fuel projects of any company in the world. Activists call these carbon bombs. Total is tied to at least 30 of them. Together, these projects represent a staggering 70 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. To put this into perspective, that is more than half of the remaining global carbon budget left to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And this expansion is happening despite an absolute ironclad scientific consensus that to meet the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree target, there is no room for new oil, gas, or coal projects. So how do you force a company this powerful to change its entire economic model? You weaponize a pioneer piece of legislation, in this case, France's 2017 Corporate Duty of Vigilance law. Originally passed to stop multinational corporations from hiding behind messy global supply chains, this law requires large French companies to draft, publish, and strictly implement what's called a Vigilance plan. This plan must map out and actively prevent serious violations of human rights, public health, and environmental destructions caused by the company, its subsidiaries, or its suppliers. If a company turns a blind eye or writes a subpar plan, the law gives judges the teeth to step in. Courts can issue sweeping injunctions to force compliance, and they can order massive financial penalties. But here's the catch. This is the first time in French history that judges are being asked to apply this law directly to climate change, which the law itself doesn't explicitly name.
We're relying on this French duty of vigilance law, and it regulates multinational actors, but in France. So corporate actors who are domiciled, who have their headquarters in France. That's a requirement. We cannot sue under this law a US group or from another nationality. Still, the question is still relevant. We still had to deal with this question before courts and also in the media always, because of course Total is not the only polluting company in France, but there's still a clear link, a causal link between producing fossil fuels and the emission of greenhouse gases. And for us, it was clear from the beginning that it had to be fossil fuel companies, like in the other climate cases. So for these reasons, we decided to take this case against Total. Then we also heard about the case Milieu Defensi against Shell, who was in its inception at the same moment, and we coordinated with the Milieu Defensi team in 2018 to know what they are gonna plead and ask before the courts and how we can find ways to collaborate. And the TotalEnergies case, what we are doing, it's a bit different from the Shell case. We're not asking for specific greenhouse gas reduction targets, but we are asking rather more sectoral things, oil and gas production reduction. We are also asking that the company should stop new exploration of oil and gas assets and production sites. That's really important because in order to still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but even 2 degrees, we have to stop and seize completely the expansion of fossil fuels worldwide. But on a more alternative basis, we're also asking simply to establish and implement a 1.5 degree or Paris compatible strategy. So this gives more leeway, more discretion to the company.
Total's defense strategy is essentially to argue that the climate is simply too big for them to be held responsible. They claim climate change is a global, multifactorial phenomenon, so you can't pin it on one company. But Paul and the coalition are firing back. They point out that the law's wording is intentionally broad. It explicitly covers all serious environmental risks. And because Total chooses exactly what volumes of oil and gas to extract and market, they exercise decisive control over the mass emissions their products generate. While the lawsuit against TotalEnergies is anchored in French legislation, it unfolds against a rapidly evolving international legal landscape. In 2025, the global climate litigation movement received a major boost from the International Court of Justice, which issued a landmark advisory opinion on states' obligations regarding the climate crisis.
The United Nations Top Court has found that countries that fail to take measures to prevent climate change could be in violation of international law.
The court thus concludes that under international law, the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment is essential for the enjoyment of other human rights.
While it focuses exclusively on states, this ruling adds massive fuel and legitimacy to lawsuits like the one against TotalEnergies. As governments are forced to introduce stricter regulations to meet their new ICJ obligations, the legal net tightens around the private sector. If the state is legally required to prevent climate harm, it must legally compel its biggest polluters to do the same.
There are still many different aspects of this opinion which are relevant for our case. First, that there is a consensus to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, that all states have to do their share independently of the actions of others, and that's a strong principle that should also be applied to corporate actors. Everyone has to do its best to limit warming as much as possible, even if the others are not acting. Because if we're still waiting for the others, the system simply doesn't work. If we want to have this systemic change would only function if everybody if everybody wants to move in this direction. But in order to get this systemic movement, we also need, of course, individual actors to do this and to lead by example, to do what they can. The International Court of Justice also said that states must regulate corporate actors, so there's a duty to regulate. So basically, by clearly laying out this duty, we are saying that the court, the third branch of the state, has to also protect the climate, including by making sure that if companies are not adequately regulated, clearly regulated in the climate era, that they have to step in, especially if they're not doing their share, if they're not reducing their greenhouse gases as much as possible, that they have to step in and ensuring, based on general laws such as the French duty of vigilance law or tort law, that it's indeed reducing its greenhouse gases. There are also many other aspects of this ruling which are relevant, especially also the fact that the court found that there are possible international wrongful acts stemming from an increase or a new oil and gas explorations, production sites. And here we also pointing the court to this specific aspect that what Total is doing, it's potentially contributing to unlawful acts on the international level.
Publicly, Total calls itself a major player in the energy transition and boasts an ambition to hit carbon neutrality by 2050. But the courts have already seen through the smoke and mirrors, convicting the company for greenwashing in October of last year. That conviction came from the Paris Judicial Court, the same court that heard Notre Affaire Tous case against TotalEnergies. It found the company guilty of misleading consumers with greenwashing regarding its 2050 net zero targets and carbon neutrality claims. It was the first greenwashing judgment ever issued against the oil industry's net zero narrative. The court ruled that the company has misled consumers in its advertising by giving the impression that it is part of the solution to climate change, despite continuing to promote and sell more fossil fuels.
It's scientifically, it's mathematically not possible to go still for an increase in fossil fuels, at the same time saying that you are greening your company, that you are making a contribution to the sustainable energy movement, and in order to achieve the Paris Agreement. That's simply not possible.
Beyond the target reduction figures, the lawsuit tackles one of the most heavily contested battlegrounds in corporate climate law, Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are not generated directly by Total's factories or drilling rigs. Instead, they're the indirect emissions created when end users, ordinary consumers, businesses, and transport networks actually burn Total's oil and gas products. Because Total is a fossil fuel giant, these downstream emissions represent a staggering 90% of the company's total carbon footprint. The company argues that it bears no legal responsibility for Scope 3 emissions, claiming they are entirely attributable to the choices of its consumers. But the claimants strongly reject that logic. They contend that Scope 3 emissions are the direct, entirely foreseeable consequences of Total's core business model and corporate strategy. In their eyes, because Total chooses exactly what volumes of fossil fuels are extracted, refined, and marketed, the company exercises decisive control over the resulting emissions.
The company, what it's doing, it's only reducing its direct emissions. It is not reducing its indirect emissions, which are released then by the consumers, so the so-called Scope 3 emissions. It tries to avoid liability towards these indirect Scope 3 emissions. And it tries to do this in order to not reduce its oil and gas production. And what the company is also saying is that it has a net zero target in line with society. So basically, the company is saying it is only following what the society is doing. It is expecting a shift in the energy demand. For the company, if there is still an increasing or a stable demand in fossil fuels, it will not change. It will only adjust if the demand changes. What we are asking instead is that the company takes proactive steps and does not wait that the fossil fuel demand decreases, but takes proactive steps, voluntary steps, in order to reduce the fossil fuels, in order to make a real contribution to the achievement, to still have the chance to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and achieve the Paris Agreement. It's simply necessary to do so because the company has two options. First, it can also make sure that decarbonized energies, low carbon energies are available, more available. So it's already doing this, but in very insufficient manner. And on the other hand, it can also influence the energy demand. And since it can do both, and it's also proven by science, especially by the International Energy Agency, that corporate actors, including in the fossil fuel sector, in the oil and gas sector, can take proactive steps and must do so in order to still have a chance to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And these reports are even reviewed by these companies, including by Total. So we think that we have a strong case.
The Paris Judicial Court will hand down a verdict this month on June 25th, after the involved parties debated during a 2-day hearing in February. The hearings mark the end of 6 years of legal proceedings, often delayed by Total's procedural challenges.
It was a very special moment for us because we were waiting for this moment for several years. We started this case in the year 2018 by sending a first letter to the company, and then we got a reply shortly after. 2019, the company wanted to change something. They integrated the climate dimension in its vigilance plan. So they wanted to show that they are doing something and they wanted to change. But we clearly noticed that it will only be a cosmetic change, right? That's why we decided in the year 2020 to file the complaint with the court. But this was 6 years ago, and in these 6 years, we had to litigate on the competence of the court, on the jurisdiction of the court. We achieved this in the year 2022 before the Supreme Court. Then we had to plead the admissibility of the case the 2 next years. We got a final ruling in the year 2024. And finally, we have the chance to discuss the merits of the case, what properly matters, just some weeks ago. So this was incredibly long, an incredibly long battle, a battle which is at odds timing-wise with the climate emergency. So when we started this case, we really thought, okay, we cracked the system somehow. We found arguments that could really make a change and a swift change. And this is what happens more or less with the rulings against the states. And that's where like more quick developments happens. But with respect to corporate actors, except the Shell ruling, there are no ruling almost on the merits worldwide. So clearly, the lawyers which are defending the companies are well more equipped and are making sure that these cases are as long as possible. So they're using all the delaying tactics. And so that's why it took us so long to arrive at that point. We were, of course, proud and happy to finally get this day in court. But on the other hand, we were also conscious that it's almost too late. The 1.5 carbon budget is almost depleted. That's really tough as a situation. But on the other hand, it's still possible to change things, to make sure that global warming will not be so dangerous as it can be. So as long as there is some hope, there should be some action.
Just 2 weeks before the hearings were set to begin, the case took an unexpected turn. France's public prosecutor's office stepped in as an intervening party, issuing an official legal opinion that effectively aligned the state's legal apparatus with TotalEnergies. The prosecutor argued that the scope of the corporate duty of vigilance law simply does not extend to climate change. In a formal memorandum, the office stated, quote, "A global phenomenon, global warming concerns everyone, but it is essentially the responsibility of the international community and states." It was a highly unusual intervention that caught the plaintiffs by surprise, signaling just how much intentional resistance the lawsuit is facing. But Paul views the state's sudden move not as a defeat, but as a confirmation of their strategy, and says the prosecutor's decision to intervene only underscores the massive structural stakes of this trial.
We think this position is wrong. And just like legally speaking, we have this French duty of vigilance law, but as a complementary legal basis, we also relying on the prevention of the ecological injury. And this legal basis was also the one which succeeded in the case against the state. So we think we have a very strong position, and that we can make sure that the court finds that the law is applicable in the climate change context, and that it requires from companies mitigation actions in order to reduce greenhouse gases, in order to make sure that they show some consistency with the Paris Agreement. We think that's really achievable, and if we can have this ruling from the court, it can reintroduce us also some, I would say actually some hope also on the European level after the European Union deregulated, rolled back this Article 22 of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, because this directive is very similar to the French duty of vigilance law.
France's duty of vigilance law directly inspired the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which the European Union adopted in 2024. The rollback Paul is referring to, which came into force in March as part of a simplification package, effectively reduced the scope of the directive, delayed compliance deadlines, and removed specific climate transition plan mandates. Against this backdrop, the TotalEnergies case places the French judiciary at the center of a broader struggle over whether binding corporate climate duties will be upheld or dismantled in Europe.
The French duty of vigilance law, it also requires corporate actors to prevent serious human rights and environmental harms, but it does not apply explicitly to climate change because of the deletion of Article 22. And so if the Paris Court finds that these principles are applicable in the climate change context, then it should also be the case for the European directive. And the European directive is, of course, way more important. It applies to the whole European Union, to the all European actors, but also on foreign actors which are doing business in Europe. And so all American, all Chinese companies would be concerned because all these corporate actors are active in Europe.
For the first time in France, judges this month will rule on whether an oil and gas multinational can be legally compelled to reduce fossil fuel production, not merely disclose risks or set voluntary targets. If successful, this case moves the climate litigation debate away from empty corporate pledges and toward concrete enforceable obligations. The timing could not be more critical. While international scientific consensus maintains that any new fossil fuel expansion is fundamentally incompatible with a 1.5-degree warming limit, TotalEnergies continues to invest heavily in oil and gas growth. A ruling against Total could mark a systemic turning point, shifting the focus of climate litigation from government policy to the actual business models of the world's largest fossil fuel companies. Ultimately, what the Paris court decides will likely influence cases far beyond France, as judiciaries worldwide grapple with how to translate climate science and human rights law into binding limits on fossil fuel production.